There's an interesting phenomenon with your campaign in Florida. You're picking up major support from top legislators. The 3 future House speakers of the Florida House all have endorsed you. You have at least 11 other state legislators who've endorsed you. Yet your poll numbers in the state don't reflect that. They don't show that you're moving so strongly. Why is there that disconnect?
Well, first of all, the early days of campaigning in a state like Florida are retail. You got to get some leaders locally, and we're very, very blessed and fortunate to have some of the most prominent leaders in Florida supporting my campaign. So that's validation, I think, of my leadership and my record, and we're grateful for that help. But keep in mind that the early polls don't predict anything, ultimately. If they did, Hillary Clinton or Rudy Giuliani would be president today. The national polls basically always misinterpret the final outcome, or mispredict the final outcome, I should say. That Florida plays a pivotal role, not just in the general election, but more often than not in the primary. This can be kind of the state where the putative nominee is selected, and we take that very seriously. So we're going to put time and energy and effort into introducing our campaign and my vision for America on taxes, on spending, on health care, and getting the jobs growing and the economy moving again, which I got a great record on, to Florida.
The debt ceiling. It sounds like you would have voted no, or if you were in the Congress, or you would have vetoed it if you were president. Is that right?
Well, the debt ceiling agreement was really disappointing. And look, this is an agreement that doesn't really fix the problem. I analogize it to you having a fever, and then you got a fever for a few hours, maybe you take an aspirin, but if you got a fever for days and weeks or months on end, you can't just take an aspirin. You got to fix the underlying problem, and they didn't do that. They just kind of sugar-coated over it or took a fiscal aspirin, but they didn't really fix the underlying structural problems of the country. And while the debt ceiling vote was dramatic and important, so is getting the real problems fixed. And we got a problem that the government is spending dramatically more money than it's taking in. And this deal only makes it a teeny bit better, not significantly better, and that's not good enough for America.
So you would have voted against it?
That's right.
It sounds to me as if that's kind of making the perfect the enemy of the good. You've said that while this is my interpreting of your statement, it was basically a mediocre deal. It doesn't sound like it was a bad deal. And this is one of the first times that a debt ceiling vote, one of the first times, not the only time, that a debt ceiling vote was accompanied by other issues. So why not kind of move ahead, even though it's kind of a mediocre thing, and then continue to fix those structural issues?
Because I don't think underwhelming or disappointing or mediocre or below average or flat out pathetic is good enough for America anymore. We are in deep trouble, and the standard shouldn't be what are those things that we can do that are mediocre, disappointing, underwhelming, uninspiring, or lacking in courage. The standard should be what can we do to continue to this country to be the greatest country on the face of the earth. We should have a president who's leading the debate on these issues, and instead he's hiding, he's ducking, he's bobbing, he's weaving. You can't even find him on the major financial issues of our day, how he would reform Social Security, how he would reform Medicare, how he would reform Medicaid, and so on. And we shouldn't have to look to a congressman from Wisconsin, who I appreciate. The president should be out front on these issues. And if you're president of the United States, you should lead with courage and specifics. And he's doing neither. And it's very disappointing. And on this debt ceiling deal, they barely addressed the problem at all. But most of the things that they've now promised are in the future. They're contingent upon future action. And guess what? A future president and a future Congress could undo or duck all of those as well, or most of them. And here's some truths. Number one, on Social Security, if you're on the program now or anywhere near eligibility, you shouldn't have your benefits impacted. We made a promise to you, we'll keep it. But if you're in the next generation, we're telling you now with several decades of warning, we're going to gradually raise the retirement age over time. Number two, if you're lower income or middle income, you should still get your cost of living adjustment. But in the future, if you're real wealthy, we're going to have to slow that down or take it away. That's the way it is. This thing is drowning. And what people don't realize is if we don't make these kinds of changes in current law, Social Security gets automatic cuts for everybody. So anybody who's in favor of doing nothing is in favor of cutting Social Security. And then there's similar answers for Medicaid and Medicare.
It sounds like you're against any increase taxes, or as they like to call them, revenues, to deal with the debt situation?
If you look at how we got into this hole, it's pretty clear that we didn't get into this problem because the revenues didn't keep up with the private economy. They did. What happened is federal spending and government spending more broadly went way beyond that. That's how we got into this hole. So if you want to talk about fixing the problem in a balanced way, we have to ask and answer the question, what was out of balance that created the problem? And what was out of balance that created the problem was runaway government spending.
Some of that runaway, or some of the increased spending, people would dispute whether it's runaway or not, happened in the Bush years. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, as you know, you had 2 wars, a Medicare entitlement for prescription drugs, and also the reduction in tax revenues, which helped contribute to the deficit. If that's the case, why not scale back those wars? You're talking about scaling back some Medicare, scale back some of that Medicare situation, also scale back those tax cuts. Why not get rid of some of those tax cuts, bring us back to the Clinton-era tax rates?
Well, again, as to the issue of revenues versus expenditures, you have to look back and see what got us into the mess. And again, revenues kept up with the private economy. It's the government spending that went way beyond that. Number 2, while it's fair to say that both parties in Congress and both parties in the White House over the years contributed to this problem, it's also absolutely true that President Obama has made it exponentially worse. When President Bush left office, the deficit was approximately $500 billion. It is now approximately $1.5 trillion. In other words, President Obama has essentially tripled the deficit. And to make matters worse, he promised in the first few months of his presidency that he would cut the deficit in half during his first term, which has turned out to be a broken promise.
Part of that deficit that occurred in Obama's presidency was the stimulus. And governors, Republican governors such as yourself, such as Bobby Jindal, not Charlie Crist so much because he literally embraced the stimulus, but many Republican governors were put in an awkward situation. You guys both opposed it, but also accepted the money. How do you explain that?
Well, first of all the governors of both parties took almost all the stimulus money. And there's a lot of reasons for it, but let me give you a couple from Minnesota's perspective and my perspective. Number 1, if the federal government's dumb enough to give it to us, we'll be smart enough to take it. And in Minnesota's case, we are not a net taker of money from the federal government. According to the Tax Foundation, for every dollar Minnesota sends to the federal government, we get approximately 73 cents back. And on that measurement, Minnesota is the 5th largest subsidizer or payer of the federal government in the country. So we're not a taker, we're a payer. And we more than pay for our share of federal spending.
Changing gears, a big thing that in Florida that's being debated, will be debated, it's kind of an electrifying issue, immigration, immigration reform. Is there a role for the federal government what is the role of the federal government? What is the role of the president in dealing with immigration? What would you do as president regarding immigration?
Well, one of the things that's happening is the federal government has not fulfilled its obligations in many respects, and so you have states out of necessity or frustration stepping into the breach and trying to address the issue. But the first thing we need to do is enforce the border. And so when President Bush II asked governors to help do that by volunteering to send their National Guard to the border, I was one of the first governors in the country to dispatch the Minnesota National Guard to the Arizona border as part of Operation Jumpstart to help secure and improve the situation in Arizona. I think everybody agrees, or most people agree, that that's the first in a series of steps that need to be addressed.
Anything else? I guess one of the things that's a hot spot is E-Verify, requiring private employers to use the E-Verify system to find out if someone's a documented worker or not. Do you think there should be that mandate?
Well, the system that we have now is a 1950s paper-based system, and we need to do better. If I come to you for a job, you pull out an I-9 form. I pull out some documents. You check that I gave you the documents. You photocopy them, and you throw them in your file. You have met your legal obligation. I seemingly have met mine. But what do we know about that system? We know it is a 1950s paper-based system that is susceptible to fraud. So in the year 2011, in the world of iPads and instant everything, it's reasonable, I think, to have a more modern, more accurate, less burdensome verification system. And E-Verify isn't perfect, it's getting better, but in Minnesota, it's a system that we used with pretty good success.
So would you favor that as a national requirement on businesses to use E-Verify?
Well, with the system we have now is untenable. If you're a hardware store owner, we can't expect you to conduct an international investigation as to whether the documents I'm giving you are accurate or not. And it's incumbent upon the government, federal government, I think, to have a system that employers can use that is quick, fair, accurate, non-burdensome, that verifies somebody's eligibility for employment or public benefits. I don't think that's unreasonable. The system we have now is 40 years out of date.
But to the specific point of private employers, should private employers be required to use it?
I think we should say to private employers, if you knowingly hire illegal immigrants, there's going to be a consequence for you. And I underline the word knowingly. And then I think you make available a system like E-Verify, and I don't know that you need to require them to use it, but if they refuse to use it or don't use it and then knowingly engage in illegal behavior, there should be a consequence for that.
The issue of gay marriage has cropped up. Rick Perry has been on a few sides of the issue, as some folks have pointed out recently. Should there be a U.S. constitutional amendment banning gay marriage?
I'm a strong supporter of defining marriage as between a man and a woman. It's a cornerstone of our culture and our society for obvious reasons. I don't think all domestic relationships should be deemed legally or otherwise the same as traditional marriage. And I think that needs to remain elevated. So I've supported, in fact, when I was in the Minnesota legislature, I was a co-author of the Defense of Marriage Act defining marriage as between a man and a woman. I've supported a state and federal amendment to the constitutions to define marriage as such.
How do you support being a small government conservative, yet support this government limitation on the private behavior of two people?
Well, the Constitution and our statutes and laws more broadly grant or prohibit all kinds of behaviors and rights. And so I don't think it's out of bounds in that regard. And number two, we have courts who have demonstrated they think they know better than the people on our statutes. And they feel that they should insert their personal or political views into these matters. And the only way to limit courts' excesses in that regard is to put it in the laws or the Constitution.
Something a lot of folks don't like to do. One word to describe. If you could use, what's the one word you would use to describe these following people? Barack Obama.
Inept.
Mitt Romney.
Well, I'm not going to play the word game with the Republican opponents, but if you, as it relates to Obama, I think he's been abysmal as a president.
So you wouldn't want to do it with Rick Perry, Sarah Palin, Michelle Bachmann, Herman
really.
Cain, or John Huntsman?
No.
Or Ron Paul?
Yeah, I mean, their records and who they are as people, I don't think is, best summarized in one word anyhow, and interesting for fodder for you guys, but not so interesting for me.
What's the best thing you've done in the campaign, and the one thing you wish you could have changed in the campaign so far?
Well, in one of the debates I had recently, I was asked a direct point about Massachusetts health care, and I stayed focused on Obama, didn't answer the question about Mitt's role in health care in Massachusetts, and I think that was viewed by some as a missed opportunity, and I think it was. So I would say that's something I would have done differently. And what was the other part of the question?
If you could elaborate on that, what would you have said?
Well, just what I've said many times before, which is that obviously the Massachusetts healthcare plan was the blueprint or the forerunner for Obamacare, and the president himself has essentially said that, and any suggestion of the contrary I just don't think is credible.
And what's the one thing you're proudest of that you're happy with in your campaign so far?
Well, we've made some really good progress. When I first started this out, I'm from a small state. Hardly anybody knew who I was. And we've made some good progress. There was a new poll out statewide in Iowa recently that had us in second place, moving up from 6th or 7th. That's good progress, and there's a lot of hard work behind that, a lot of great people. And when we come to Florida and see some of your best and brightest leaders embracing our campaign in Florida, including future Speaker Will Weatherford and others, it really gives me a sense of validation that our message and my campaign and my vision for America is resonating.